Let me tell you about a room full of confident men. It's August of 1976. The sun outside Lubbock, Texas is doing what the August sun always does out there, pressing down on everything flat and merciless, like it has a personal grudge against shade. The panhandle is bone dry and cotton rich, and the equipment auction at the Haskell Brothers yard on the south side of town is packed to the walls with men who know it. Pickup trucks are parked 3 rows deep in the caliche lot. The smell inside is motor oil, coffee from a 30-cup percolator, and the particular kind of sweat that comes from men who work outdoors but have recently put on a clean shirt. This is boom country in the middle of a boom year. The Soviet grain deal of 1972 had opened export markets nobody had dreamed of before, and cotton prices have been climbing steady for 4 years. If you're farming 1,000 acres or more in Lubbock County in 1976, you feel, in a quiet and Texan way, that the world is confirming what you always suspected about yourself. These men sit near the front. Their boots are cleaner. Their names are on the lips of the auctioneers before the bidding even starts. Now here's what you need to understand about that room. There were maybe 90 men in it. 80 of them farmed on credit, operating loans, equipment notes, land mortgages stacked like a hand of cards they were sure they knew how to play. They talked about leverage the way you talk about a tool you're good with. They talked about expansion the way you talk about a destination you've already decided on. The room had a particular hum to it. The hum of men who believed the direction of things would not change. One man sat near the back wall, in the 3rd row from the last. His name was Earl Pruitt. He was 41 years old. He had driven in alone from Slayton, 30 miles southeast, in a GMC pickup with a cracked dash and 112,000 miles on it. He was not a tall man, not a loud man, not the kind of man a room noticed when he walked in. His jacket was sun-bleached to a color that had once been tan, and was now the color of old paper. He had a plain face, a farmer's hands, and the particular stillness of a person who has spent years working alone in quiet fields. He sat with his back straight and his hat on the empty seat beside him, and in the breast pocket of his jacket he carried a single white envelope, folded once. Inside that envelope was a cashier's check for $14,200. That was nearly everything he had. He had come for one thing, lot 22 on the auction sheet. A 1968 John Deere 9600 cotton picker, serviced in working condition, with a set of row units that could handle his fields without modification. He had written the lot number at the top of the sheet in pencil and circled it. He had written the number 14,200 in the margin and underlined it twice. That was his ceiling. That was the number. He sat near the back wall, and nobody turned to look at him. Now I have to take you back, because the envelope in Earl Pruitt's pocket didn't appear from nowhere. $14,000 does not arrive in a working farmer's breast pocket by accident. It arrives by a particular kind of discipline, and that discipline came from a particular kind of man, and that man was Earl's father, Curtis Pruitt, who farmed 80 acres outside Slayton, and never farmed more than that in his entire life. 80 acres. In a county where men measured themselves in thousands, Curtis Pruitt farmed 80 acres of dryland cotton and grain sorghum and considered himself, without any apparent effort, a free man. The land had come to him from his own father, who had broken it originally in the 1920s. It was not prime ground. It was caliche heavy on the west end and sand prone on the east, and it asked more of you than richer ground would. But it was paid for, entirely, completely, on paper and in fact paid for. Curtis Pruitt owed nothing on it, not to a bank, not to a neighbor, not to anyone. Earl was born on that land in 1935. He grew up in the house his grandfather had built, which had a linoleum kitchen floor and a pattern of green and white squares, worn smooth in the path from the door to the stove. Most of what Earl learned that mattered, he learned at the table in that kitchen, over supper, in the plain and unhurried way his father talked about farming and land and money. He was 11 years old, the summer of 1946, when his father said the sentence that would shape the next 50 years of his life. They had been talking about the Hendersons, a family 3 miles east who had taken on a federal land bank loan to buy an additional quarter section. The land was good. The price was reasonable. Everyone agreed it made sense on paper. Curtis Pruitt listened to his son describe what he'd heard the Henderson boy say about it at school, and then he set down his fork and said quietly and without drama, "What you owe on, the bank holds. Everything else is yours." Earl didn't write it down. He didn't need to. Some sentences land in a person at exactly the right age and in exactly the right tone of voice, and they don't leave. They become the operating principle, the lens, the measure by which every future decision gets checked. He worked his father's 80 acres through his 20s, took them over fully when Curtis died in 1963, married a woman named Ruth Ann, who had grown up on a farm herself and understood without needing it explained why he kept a savings ledger in the kitchen drawer and updated it on the first of every month. They had 2 children. They lived without extravagance, not from deprivation, but from a philosophy so deeply held it had stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling simply like the way things were. For 9 years, from 1967 to 1976, Earl Pruitt put money aside in a savings account at the First National Bank of Slayton, designated in his ledger with 2 words: equipment, cash. He had watched hired cotton pickers come and go with their unpredictable schedules and their rising fees. He had watched the weather cost him weeks of harvest window because he was waiting on a crew that had gone north to another man's fields. He knew what a cotton picker of his own would mean. Not wealth, not expansion, just reliability. Just the ability to harvest his own crop on his own schedule with his own machine that he owned, outright, free and clear. 9 years of saving brought him to $14,200, which brought him, on a Tuesday morning in August of 1976, to a folding chair in the 3rd row from the back wall of the Haskell Brothers auction yard, invisible to a room full of confident men. And that's when the auctioneer called Lot 22. But that's not what this story is really about. Here's how an auction works when nobody expects much from it. The auctioneer calls the lot number. His assistant wheels the item into view, or points to it out in the yard, or reads the description off a clipboard if the thing is too big to move. The crowd shifts. Men who have been talking lean forward a little. Men who aren't interested go back to their coffee. And in the first few seconds of bidding, you can usually tell how the room feels about a thing. Whether it's wanted badly or just adequately. Whether this is going to be a fight or a formality. Lot 22 was a formality. That was the general understanding. A 1968 John Deere 9600 cotton picker, 8 years old, well used but serviced. Useful machine. Nothing extraordinary. The kind of equipment that makes sense for a mid-size operation but doesn't excite a man farming 3,000 acres who's already got 2 of them. The auctioneer opened it at $6,000, which was a reasonable starting point, and waited. Earl Pruitt raised his paddle from the 3rd row back. A man near the front raised his a moment later. His name was Gene Forbes. He farmed 2,200 acres north of Lubbock, owned land in 3 counties, and had arrived that morning in a white Ford dually that was cleaner than most people's living rooms. He was a big man, not fat, but large in the way that comes with authority. And he sat in the 4th row from the front with the easy posture of someone who has never once in his life worried about whether he belonged in a room. He had a wide face, a slow smile, and the habit of speaking at a volume calibrated to be heard by 1 or 2 rows in every direction. He had not come for the cotton picker. He had come for a grain drill in Lot 31 and a set of planter units in Lot 38. But when the bidding on Lot 22 opened and something moved from the back of the room, he turned his head the way large men sometimes do. Not quickly, but with the full weight of his attention. And he looked, and he saw Earl Pruitt. And he did not recognize him. And he turned back around. The bidding moved in $500 steps. $7,000, $7,500, $8,000, $8,500. This was already above where the room had expected it to land, and the men who weren't bidding started to pay attention. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. The auctioneer, a lean man named Dale Weeks, who had been running sales in this yard for 11 years and had a microphone voice like a radio preacher, noticed the room shifting and did what good auctioneers do. He fed it. He looked toward the back and said, into the microphone, with a grin that the whole room could hear, "Now, son, you sure you're in the right auction?" The room obliged. Laughter moved through it in a wave, easy and careless, the way laughter moves through a crowd that feels like it's all on the same side. A few men turned to look. Earl Pruitt did not look back at them. He sat with his paddle in his lap and his eyes on the auctioneer and his face carrying no expression worth reading. He raised his paddle. 9,000. Gene Forbes raised his. 9,500. Now here's what you need to understand about what was happening. Gene Forbes didn't need this machine. He was bidding the way a man bids when the bidding itself has become the point. When it stops being about the equipment and starts being about the back of the room, and the sun-bleached jacket, and the paddle that keeps coming up from where it has no business coming from. It was not malicious exactly. It was the reflex of a man who was accustomed to getting what he pointed at, and someone had put an obstacle in his path that he hadn't anticipated. 10,000, 10,500, 11,000. The laughter had stopped. The room was quiet now in the way auction rooms go quiet when they realize they are watching something that wasn't on the program. Earl Pruitt had a ceiling, $14,200. He had drawn that line in pencil in the margin of his auction sheet, and he had underlined it twice, and he had meant it as a discipline, a boundary, a number that kept him from becoming something he did not want to be. He reached it at 13,500, and the line he'd drawn looked up at him from the paper in his lap. Gene Forbes bid 14,000. The auctioneer looked to the back of the room. Earl Pruitt looked at the folded envelope in his breast pocket. $14,200. He thought about 9 years. He thought about the first of every month and the savings ledger in the kitchen drawer, and Ruth Ann sitting across the table checking the figures the way she always did, neat and steady, never questioning the pace of it, only making sure the numbers were right. He raised his paddle. 14,500. He had gone over. He knew it when he did it. He had the cash. $212 beyond the check, in his wallet, cash money. And he spent it in that moment without regret, because this was the machine. And this was the day, and 9 years had brought him here, and he was not going home without it. Gene Forbes paused. It was only a second or two, but the room felt it. The auctioneer felt it. Earl Pruitt felt it. Then Gene Forbes turned in his seat. Not fully, just a quarter turn. Enough to look back along the rows toward the wall. And he said it loud enough for the row behind him to hear clearly, and the rows beyond that to hear well enough. Where does a man farming 80 acres find that kind of money? He said it with a smile. The smile was the worst part. It wasn't angry. It was genuinely curious. The way you're curious about a puzzle that doesn't quite fit together. He looked at Earl Pruitt the way you look at something that has surprised you mildly, and he waited, and the room waited with him. Earl Pruitt said nothing. He sat with his paddle in his lap and his back straight, and his face holding that same expression of no expression. And he looked at the auctioneer, and he waited. Gene Forbes faced forward again. The auctioneer said, 14,500. Do I hear 15? Silence. Sold. $14,500. Earl Pruitt walked to the cashier's table and wrote a check for $14,500 drawn on the First National Bank of Slayton. He arranged transport with a man who hauled equipment on a flatbed out of Lubbock for $30 a load. He retrieved his hat from the empty seat beside him. He walked out through the double doors into the August sun, which was still pressing down on everything flat and merciless, and he drove home to Slayton in the GMC with the cracked dash. The cotton picker was delivered to his farm 2 days later. It belonged entirely to him. He owed nothing on it. Not to a bank. Not to Gene Forbes. Not to anyone in that room who had laughed when they were supposed to. He started it up that evening, just to hear it run. And Ruth Ann came out of the house and stood in the yard, and they didn't say much because there wasn't much that needed saying. It was the sound of 9 years arriving right on schedule. But the real story starts 6 years later, when the ground shifted under everyone's feet. And only one man was standing on something solid. Let me tell you about the way a disaster arrives in farm country. It doesn't come like a storm. It doesn't announce itself with wind and a drop in pressure and enough warning to get the animals in. It comes the way a slow leak comes, quietly, at first unnoticeable. And then one morning you walk into the barn, and the floor is underwater. And you realize the leak has been going on for a long time, and you simply hadn't looked closely enough at the right places. The Texas farm crisis of the early 1980s came that way. The signs were there in '79, if you knew how to read them. Commodity prices had been climbing for years, and climbing prices do a particular thing to people. They make the future look like a straight line pointed upward, and straight lines pointed upward make borrowing feel like wisdom. Banks were lending. The Federal Reserve was printing. Land values in Lubbock County had doubled in 6 years, and a man who owned 2,000 acres on paper felt, in the way paper wealth makes you feel, like he was standing on bedrock. Then Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, decided to break inflation. He broke it the way you break something that has gotten too large and too fast, by tightening the thing that was feeding it. Interest rates climbed past 12% in 1979, past 15 in 1980, past 18. By 1981, the prime rate touched 21.5%, which is a number that sounds abstract until you carry it against a land note or an operating loan and do the arithmetic at your kitchen table and feel the arithmetic do something to the air in the room. Commodity prices fell the same years the rates climbed. Cotton dropped, grain dropped. The export boom that had made the 1970s feel like a permanent condition turned out to have been a condition with an end date, the way most booms do. The Soviet grain embargo of 1980 didn't help. Markets that had been open tightened. Prices that had been high found their natural floor. And the floor was lower than most men had planned for when they were signing the notes. And this is the part that matters. The men who had borrowed against rising land values to buy more land were now holding land that was falling in value while paying interest rates that had no ceiling anyone could see. The leverage that had felt like a tool in the 1970s revealed itself in the 1980s as what it had always actually been. A claim. A prior claim. Senior to yours. Held by someone else. On everything you thought you owned. Earl Pruitt watched it happen from the outside. That is not a comfortable place to watch from. I want you to understand that. There is nothing pleasant about watching your neighbors go under. These were men he had known his whole life. Men he sat near at the co-op. Men whose children went to school with his children. Men who had farmed this same flat country under the same flat sky for the same reason he had, which was because it was what they knew and who they were. He watched Donnie Calvert, who farmed 420 acres east of Slayton and had taken on a grain elevator partnership in 1978, lose the partnership in 1982, and come out of it with 200 acres, a 10-year-old tractor, and a forehead that had aged beyond his years. Donnie didn't complain about it publicly. He just quietly got smaller. The way a man gets smaller when something large has been taken from him, and he is trying to determine what size he actually is without it. He watched 3 families on the north end of the county sell equipment at distressed prices to meet operating loan payments, selling at the worst possible time, into a market flooded with other men selling for the same reason, which meant the prices were as low as they were ever going to be, and the men selling knew it, and sold anyway, because the alternative was worse. And he watched Gene Forbes. Gene Forbes, who had farmed 2,200 acres north of Lubbock in 1976, and had borrowed heavily through the late 70s to push that number toward 3,000, began selling in 1983. Not voluntarily, exactly, but in the way that becomes voluntary when the bank has made the alternative clear. He sold 280 acres on the south end of his operation at 40% below the price he had paid for it 4 years earlier. He sold a grain storage setup he had built in 1979. He sold the white Ford dually and bought a used one. He kept farming. He was not ruined, not entirely, but he was smaller, and he knew it, and the county knew it. And there is a particular kind of knowing that settles into a man's face when the story he had been telling about himself turns out to have had a different ending than the one he planned. Earl Pruitt had no debt to service. He had no notes to meet, no operating loan to roll over at 20%, no land value to watch fall on paper while the bank watched it with him. He farmed his 80 acres and he paid his bills in the same month he received them, and he kept his savings ledger in the kitchen drawer. He had opened a second savings account at the Slayton branch of First National in 1979, when he had first felt the shift in the air, the way you feel a change in weather before the instruments confirm it. He had labeled it in his ledger the way he labeled everything, plainly, without drama, in his small, neat hand. Next. That was the whole label. One word. He didn't specify what next meant because he didn't need to. Next meant what it always meant. The next thing that was right. Purchased at the right time. Owned outright. Free and clear. He added to that account every month from 1979 through 1985. 6 years of steady saving while the world around him was contracting, and the men who had borrowed were selling off the pieces of themselves. In the spring of 1985, a land auction was announced outside Post, Texas, 30 miles south of Lubbock. 160 acres of prime dryland cotton ground, being liquidated by an estate in financial distress. Good soil, productive history, no improvements to speak of, no irrigation equipment to factor in, just land. Flat, clean, honest West Texas farmland going to whoever showed up with the money in a market where almost nobody had money, and almost everyone was afraid. The auction was on a Thursday morning in April. Cool still, the way April mornings are out there before the heat arrives for the season. A smaller crowd than the Haskell brothers' yard in 76, maybe 40 men. Some of them farm management company representatives in newer trucks. A few independent farmers. A banker or two standing at the back with their hands in their pockets and their faces arranged in the careful, neutral expression of men who are there to observe, not participate. Earl Pruitt sat in the back row. Same work jacket, 9 years older. The color of it now past old paper and approaching the color of the land itself. He had a cashier's check in his breast pocket drawn on the First National Bank of Slutton. 2 farm management companies opened the bidding. They were methodical about it, incremental, professional, the way organizations bid when the decision has been made by committee and the ceiling has been set by a spreadsheet. They moved the price up in careful steps. Earl Pruitt moved it up with them. At a certain point, one company stopped. Their ceiling had been reached, or their instructions had run out, or whoever was on the other end of the calculation had decided the number no longer made sense. They lowered their paddle and became observers. The second company stayed a little longer. They pushed it 3 more increments, the way you push something when you still believe you can outlast the other side. Earl Pruitt raised his paddle the last time. The second company was done. The auctioneer called it. 160 acres of prime dryland cotton ground, sold to the man in the back row in the sun-bleached work jacket for a crisis floor price that would look, in 10 years, like the best transaction anyone made in Lubbock County in a decade. He paid cash. He drove home to Slayton with 240 acres free and clear, no debt on any of it, and a ledger entry in the kitchen drawer that now said, in the space below, next, paid. The room at the post auction had gone quiet when the gavel came down, but this time Earl Pruitt noticed the silence was different. In 1976, the silence had been the silence of surprise. The small farmer from the back wall doing something the room had not expected from him, something that didn't fit the story the room had already written about who he was and what he could do. This silence was something else. This was the silence of men who were looking at the back row and understanding, maybe for the first time, what they were actually looking at. Not a small farmer who had gotten lucky once. Not a curiosity, but a man who had been doing something, quietly and without announcement, for a very long time, and who was still standing in a landscape where standing required something most of them had not held on to. It was the silence of recognition, and that recognition had a weight to it. The particular weight of a lesson arriving too late to be useful. But the lesson itself, what it cost, and what it was worth, and who finally asked to hear it, that part comes last. Let me tell you about the last conversation that matters in this story. It happened in the spring of 1986 on a Tuesday morning at the Farmers Co-op on the east side of Lubbock, where men came to buy seed and chemicals, and to stand in the parking lot for longer than the errand required, talking in the way that farmers talk. Sideways at first, then straight, once the weather and the prices have been covered and there's nothing left to hide behind. Earl Pruitt had driven in from Slayton to pick up a parts order. He was 51 years old. His hair had gone the color of January grass, and the lines on his face had deepened into the kind of lines that aren't just age, but are also weather and early mornings, and the particular squint of a man who has spent 5 decades looking at flat horizons. He was loading the parts into the bed of his truck. A different GMC now, though not a newer one by much. When he heard his name, he turned around. Gene Forbes was walking across the parking lot toward him. He was 63 now. Gene Forbes. Still a large man, but the largeness had changed character. The easy authority that had come off him in that auction room in 76 like heat off August pavement, that was quieter now. Not gone, but settled into something more complicated. The way a man carries himself differently after the world has shown him the specific shape of his own miscalculation. He was still farming, 1,500 acres, give or take, mostly leased now where he had once owned. He had come through the crisis intact enough to keep going, which was more than some men could say, and he knew it, and it did not entirely comfort him. He walked up to Earl's truck and he said good morning, and Earl said good morning back, and they talked about the spring planting for a minute, and the price of cotton, and a road construction project on the highway between Post and Lubbock that had been making the drive inconvenient for 3 months. They covered the necessary ground. Then Gene Forbes put his hands in his pockets and looked at the gravel of the parking lot for a moment, and when he looked up, his face had changed into something more direct. He said, "Earl, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking it honestly." Earl waited. "How did you do it?" All those years, everybody around you was expanding, everybody was borrowing, the land was going up and the yields were good, and every banker in 3 counties was telling you to leverage what you had into something bigger. How did you sit still? He wasn't asking it the way he might have asked it in 1976, from the 4th row near the front of the auction room, with that wide, easy smile and a volume calibrated to carry. He was asking it the way a man asks when he genuinely does not know the answer and has recently paid a price for not knowing it. There was no performance in it, just the question, plain and real, standing in the parking lot between them. Earl Pruitt looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Debt's not a number, Gene. It's an arrangement. You borrow money. You've made an arrangement with someone that gives them a say in your decisions. Might be a small say at first. Might feel like nothing. But it's there. And when things turn, and things always turn, that say gets bigger, and yours gets smaller. Fast." Gene Forbes listened. "I didn't want anyone to have a say," Earl said. "Not in my fields, not in my equipment, not in my land. My daddy taught me that, and I believed him, and so I just never started the arrangement. That's the whole of it." Gene Forbes was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Earl would remember and repeat for the rest of his life, because it was honest in a way that cost the man saying it something real. He said, "I thought farming was a business to grow. I thought the whole point was to get bigger. More land, more equipment, more yield, more of everything. I thought the men who stayed small had either failed to see the opportunity or failed to have the nerve." He paused. "I didn't understand what you were doing. I thought you were just behind." Now here's what you need to understand about what Gene Forbes said in that parking lot. He was not a stupid man. He was not a careless man. He had farmed well, managed well, made reasonable decisions by the logic of the world he was operating in. A world that said growth was the measure, scale was the goal, and leverage was the instrument that connected where you were to where you were going. That world had been right for a while. And then it had been wrong. And the particular cruelty of the farm crisis was that it didn't punish bad farmers. It punished indebted ones. A man could farm beautifully, tend his soil, manage his water, read his weather, bring in a good yield, and still lose everything. Because the note came due in a year when the price was down and the rate was up, and the bank's patience had run its course. The farming wasn't the variable. The debt was the variable. And the debt was the one thing you had chosen entirely yourself in a different year, when everything felt like it was only going to go one direction. Gene Forbes had understood farming. He had not understood the arrangement he had made alongside it. Earl Pruitt had understood both, from the time he was 11 years old, sitting at a linoleum kitchen table in Slayton while his father set down his fork and said the thing that changed everything. Earl farmed into his 70s. He never took on debt. He never expanded beyond what the cash allowed, which meant he expanded slowly, in the way that slow things accumulate into something substantial over enough time. By the time he stepped back and handed the operation to his son Thomas in the spring of 2001, the farm was 240 acres owned free and clear, the original 80 from his father, and the 160 from the post-auction in '85, along with equipment that was paid for, a small but real operating reserve in the bank, and a ledger system that Thomas had grown up watching his father maintain. First day of every month at the kitchen table. Thomas kept the ledger. He added pages, updated the format, eventually moved the figures to a spreadsheet on a laptop. But he kept the same categories, the same discipline, the same practice of putting the pencil to the paper, or the fingers to the keys, and making sure the numbers were right. Ruth Ann had checked those numbers for 30 years, and after she passed in 1997, Earl checked them himself, and after Earl, Thomas. The philosophy moved the way useful things move, not by announcement, but by example, not by lecture, but by the accumulated daily evidence of a life lived a particular way, which over time becomes the most persuasive argument there is. In the last years of his life, Earl Pruitt was known in Slayton as a man people came to talk to. Not famous, not written about, not the subject of any article in the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, just known. Known the way a particular kind of older person gets known in a small place, as someone who had been through the thing and come out the other side with his values intact and his land in his name, and who would talk to you plainly if you asked him a plain question. Young farmers came, men who had read about the crisis in agricultural history courses at Texas Tech, and wanted to understand what it had actually felt like from inside it. Men who were starting out, looking at operating loans and land prices and trying to figure out what the right level of risk was. Which is the question every farmer faces, and most of them answer wrong at least once. Earl talked to all of them. He never used the word philosophy. He never called what he did a strategy, or a system, or a method. He just talked about what had happened, in the order it had happened, the same way I've been talking to you. He told them about the auction in '76. He told them about the 9 years of saving. He told them about the cotton picker and the check and the silence in the room when Gene Forbes stopped bidding. He told them about the crisis years and what it felt like to have no debt when everyone around you was drowning in it, which he was careful to say did not feel like triumph, because watching your neighbors lose what they built does not feel like triumph no matter how right your own decisions were. He told them about Post in '85, the back row, the work jacket, the cashier's check, the quiet. And when young men asked him what the lesson was, what the one thing was that they should take with them, he would look at them for a moment, the way he had looked at Gene Forbes in that parking lot. And he would say what his father had said at the linoleum table when Earl was 11 years old, not because it was the most sophisticated thing he knew, but because it was the truest. What you owe on, the bank holds. Everything else is yours. After Earl died, in the winter of 2009, Thomas went through the things in the farmhouse the way you go through a life. Carefully, slowly, with the awareness that objects carry weight that has nothing to do with their physical mass. In the kitchen drawer, under the current ledger and a rubber-banded stack of paid receipts going back 12 years, he found the original savings ledger. The one from the beginning. Green cover, cloth-bound. The kind of ledger book you could buy at any office supply store in 1967 for less than $1. He opened it to the first page. At the top, in his father's small, neat hand, was the account label. 2 words, equipment, cash. Below it, the first entry, January of 1967, $40. Then February, $40. Then March, $40. Page after page of it. Monthly entries in the same hand. The same amount varying slightly year to year as the farm's income varied, but never stopping, never skipping a month, never dipping below what the discipline required. 9 years of $40 and $50 and $60 entries, accumulating the way water accumulates in a dry country when you're patient enough to catch every drop. The last entry on the savings ledger was dated August of 1976, the month of the auction, the month the cotton picker came home. Below the last entry, in the same small, neat hand, his father had written 2 words. Not paid, not done, not finished.